everyone, to the CSPC 2022 pre-conference session called Enabling Collaborative Science for the Future, Lessons from a Leading Federal System. My name is Natalka Simok. I'll be co-moderating today's session with my colleague, Dr. Fred Rona. And before we begin, I just want to start in a good way. We are having this session, although it's from all over Canada and other parts of the world. I will do a land acknowledgement from Ottawa, where I am located. So I am pleased to say that I work, play, live, work on the unceded lands of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. And of course, we are very honored to also recognize the diversity of Indigenous peoples in Canada, including all First Nations, Métis Nation, and the Inuit. Welcome, everyone. So maybe we'll begin by introducing ourselves, and then I can launch in a little bit into a description of who we are and what we'll be discussing today. Very excited. We have a very interesting panel here. My name is Natalka Simok. I'm the Director General for Laboratories Canada in PSPC. It is a program, it's this 25-year strategy that Government of Canada had launched in 2008 about looking at how do we transform and build a community of practice with our various organizations of federal science organizations in Canada, and look for opportunities on how do we increase sort of collaboration, reduce barriers to collaboration, and really take a more comprehensive approach, looking at transforming infrastructure, equipment, IMIT, and like I mentioned, reducing barriers so that we can form more collaborative approaches to science. So with that, I'm going to turn over to my co-moderator, Fred, please.
Well, thank you, Natalka, and welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel. I also would like just to quickly acknowledge, I'm actually coming from Victoria, Canada, almost on the other coast of the country, and I'd like to acknowledge with respect the Wakanchen people and the traditional territories where Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanic peoples whose historical relationship with the land continue to this day. I've been involved with the Labs Canada program with Natalka and her team probably a little bit more than 2 years now. And I've been brought in as an external science advisor to the program. I have spent close to 30 years between the federal government science arena and the provincial government arena, particularly focusing in Alberta. I've been involved in a number of national, international programs in terms of science design implementation, and also dealing with many of the challenges that Labs Canada is dealing with. So I look forward to the dialogue today and co-hosting the session with Natalka. Thank you.
So before we launch into our conversation, let's do a round of introductions. Perhaps we could start with Miss Alexandra Gwynn-Payette, please.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be on this panel. And my name is, as you said, Alexandra Payette. I'm the Managing Director of the Berlin University Alliance here in Germany. It's the alliance of excellence of 3 larger universities here in Berlin, together with Charité, the University Medicine. That's it, I would say.
Thank you. I'll turn it over to Dr. Claire Sampson.
Thank you, Natalka. So my name is Claire Sampson. I'm the VP Programs and Planning at Canada Foundation for Innovation. So I'm not exactly a young woman, so I've had a long and rich and diversified career path. I started as a geophysicist and engineering analyst in private sector. Then I became a professor of earth sciences and a dean. And now I am in the field of research administration. So in all those settings, I have been able to witness the power of collaboration. You know, it's this infamous model which defies the basic law of physics, where the sum of the different parts somehow gets into something much larger. So I think I'm very happy to be here today, and especially to learn from the German model. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll turn it to Mr. Peter Wenzel Constable, please.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me here. I'm not sure we could, or you could really learn so much from the German model, because I know its problems. I'm heading a unit, a division in the German Federal Ministry for Research and Education, which is called Infrastructures for Research. This comprises a program for research buildings at universities, research equipment, plus all the generic questions of the larger research infrastructures, including the European collaboration in research infrastructures, which is very extensive. And I'm looking forward to further discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're looking forward to it as well. Dr. Danica Gustny, please.
Hi, good day, everybody. Bonjour tout le monde. C'est un plaisir d'être ici aujourd'hui. I am Danica Gustny, the president and CEO of the Canadian Museum of Nature, which, in addition to being a fantastic museum here in Ottawa, it's also a research-intensive organization that conducts significant fieldwork on biodiversity with a focus on Arctic research. I've only been in this role a couple of months, so quite new, but prior to this, I was the Vice President of Research Grants and Scholarships at the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council for Canada, and I've had a long career across all three Canadian federal research funding agencies. I'm super happy to be here, and I really want to thank the organizers for providing the space to talk about enabling collaborative science for the future. You know, we know that science is inherently a team collaborative effort. And as research becomes more interdisciplinary, intersectoral, and global, the more important it is to have the outcomes and the impacts that we're looking for. So thank you, and looking forward to this panel.
Wonderful. So I'll launch it off by saying that last year, Canada and Germany had celebrated 50 years of successful science and technology cooperation. We saw that in practice on some very critical things, including everything that we experienced with COVID, with supply shortages, and that kind of cooperation was really critical in the world to work together and resolve things. And so, it's been interesting just to watch Germany and Canada already working on many cooperative initiatives together. I mean, we believe we've already had over 1,000 joint research projects that have, spanned a spectrum of various research together, bringing together our governments, working together, various research institutes, universities, nonprofits. So there's in our industry as well. So there's plenty of good examples of where Germany and Canada have been working very well together, and many of the panelists here today will speak to those examples. What motivated me specifically to want to raise this conversation is because last year I had the great pleasure to visit some of these research institutes in federal institutes and academic institutions in Germany, and I was just struck by how they are organized, how they actually work very directly with industry. In fact, if I'm correct, I'll be corrected if I didn't get that right, but I believe that industry actually contributes quite a high percentage. I heard something as high as 20% into the federal science system. So there are really strong links between the sort of the federal mandated research and mandated science work that occurs in Germany, along with their industry, as well as Germany plays a really key role, not just within its own country, but within Europe. and then you expand that outwards. So there's very much that, from that model that we can take away, learning what you would do differently, what works well, and hearing a little bit more about that. Another aspect is just that sense of inserting competitiveness as a way to really incentivize collaboration as well. So really, this is what we're going to be trying to lead a little bit of conversation on that. Now you'll see that with Fred and I moderating this, we'll take turns asking questions, but we're taking very much an informal conversational approach to today's discussion. So, and of course, we'll very much welcome questions by the audience as well today. So I think I'm going to stop talking and maybe start off some of the conversations by starting with a question to lead us off. So as mentioned, so I visited Germany. I was very much impressed by many things, but among them were the cross-sectoral collaboration and then how that would be incentivized. So maybe to start off with, I would ask our German colleagues here today to talk about what makes Germany and the EU's approach uniquely successful in encouraging that cross-sectoral collaboration. And to launch us off, I'll turn to you, Alexandra, and then I'll turn to Peter to maybe give us a little bit of your perspective from your institution, but also just bring in your broader perspective from your background on this question to launch us off. And then after we'll open it up. Thank you. Over to you, Alexandra.
Thanks. Yeah, so I think it's probably common sense here for us that the grand challenges of our time cannot be solved by an individual discipline, an individual institution, or an individual part of a society. So collaboration is needed. And I think the key is to find a balance between competition and collaboration. So if you make collaboration part of the competition, you might have a way how you can bring in both sides together. Germany is organized in 16 states, so it's all the academic world is part of state legacy, and then you have the national level, so you have at least 17 different ways of organizing academia. And while it's quite complicated on the other side, on one side, the positive thing is it's a very diverse and richful basis, I would say. And I believe that this basis is key and really the basis for excellence and also for new ways of collaboration and raising up flagship projects. So that would be my first answer. I can say I've worked in Karlsruhe Institute for Technology before, which is a merger of a state university together with a national research lab on national level. That was the first time that a merger like this was done 10 years ago. So we have quite an experience with that. And now in Berlin, we use another model of collaboration. It's not a merger, it's really a collaboration, but with a strong alliance going forward. And I think there is no, how can I say, one size fit all. Okay, you need to understand what's your unique selling proposition, where are the synergies, how does the culture of the different institutions work, is it a collaboration more on department level or on institutional level, and then find a way to, how can I say, to have good arguments with your unique selling proposition on the political side. And when science is on a high level interest of policy making and politics, it's obviously easier to set up these collaborations.
Thanks, Alexandra. Peter, what are your thoughts?
Well, let me add to the confusion a little. In Germany, we do not only live with 17 different funding institutions, but there is one 18th, which is the European Union, a member of the European Union. So what my experience is that it works quite well as long as people talk to each other. This applies also to the side of the funders. So we have a regular conference with the states concerning science. We have our procedures there. We have established a forum on the European level, the European Strategy Forum for Research Infrastructures, to exchange views with the EU, with the European Union, and with the other member states. And if we try to reach consensus, but also we could initiate projects, corporations on the principle of well, we use the French term géométrie variable. So people, organizations finding themselves together without involving everybody necessarily. So this talking to each other is very important. Regular contact, best, some kind of formalized context would be one of the main issues. And another thing is we do have these strong research establishments on the federal level. They are not all completely federally funded, but they are joint initiatives between the states and the federal government. And they have a lot of discretion in what they are doing with their budgets. They could more or less, well, not do everything with it, but they could do everything within their task with it. And there is a long-standing agreement between the governments, federal and state governments involved, and the establishments about the level of funding and about regular increase on the level of funding. So this discretion leads to a situation where they could react relatively quickly. They could shift from staff costs to equipment, etc. And this makes the system very flexible. Okay, the conferences, of course, the universities are completely funded by the lender normally, with a few exceptions, as for example, worked out. But the lender in different ways are trying to approach a similar level for the universities. And we as federal government are trying to encourage and assist this development to promote excellency, to promote technical equipment in universities. And on the European level, we have additional funding, especially for the cross-national initiatives. So we have we had a transnational funding, which is now a little changed. For the access to research, we have projects that are specifically designed for collaboration, where you have to have at least partners from at least 2 countries, possibly more, before you could get your funding. So I think there are a lot of keys. One is reliability of the funding sources. The other one is a little push from the funders side to get into collaboration. And the third one is talk with each other, talk.
Well, thank you for that, Peter and Alexandra. I mean, clearly you've indicated, interestingly, both the complexity and the series of hierarchies that the German models are basically considering and trying to basically coalesce or to support sort of science program planning. Based on what we've heard from our German colleagues, I'm going to ask you, Claire and Danica, to maybe give us your insights on how the Canadian models of science and collaboration are maybe similar or different to what you've heard from Alexander Peter in the German model, and maybe what can we learn from each other based on our system and what has been proposed by Alexander and Peter.
May I start, Fred?
Yes, Claire, why don't we maybe start first? Thanks.
Thank you. So just a little recap for people who might not be familiar with us, the Canada Foundation for Innovation. We are the organization in Canada which funds research infrastructure. So we're talking here about instruments and lab renovations. And then we also fund the operating costs for major research facilities. So we're talking here about the Snow Lab in Sudbury, for example, or the Amundsen icebreaker. So that's who we are. We exist for 25 years. And since the beginning of the CFI, all our programs are collaborative in nature. So that's across all programs since forever. Why we're doing this is to ensure that everybody that participates in a program is committed. So usually the way it works is that the CFI puts out 50 or assumes 40% of the costs. And then the other 40% comes from the provinces and the final 20% from a variety of sources, including the institutions, rebate from vendors, etc. So that, maybe echoes a little bit parts of the German system in which, different people have to commit something concretely in order to make things happen. So this is the funding model, if you wish. Now, when we go down to proposals, so we encourage institutions to submit proposals for collaborative research. And we recognize then collaborative research is needed. It's exciting and everything, but it's also complicated. And it's complicated to administrate. So recognizing that we give 5% more in the budget to any successful proposal which involves 3 or more institutions. And finally, I can say that our rules allow pieces of equipment to be located not necessarily on the property of the institution which submitted the proposal. We recognize that the equipment is sometimes best located somewhere else. And examples here with our friends from Europe are that we have CFI-funded instruments in CERN for high energy physics. And we have also instruments that are part of the telescopes in Chile. So as long as the Canadian researchers keep the control on who can access the instruments, then we are allowing the instruments to be located where they can best serve the research. And then, this flexibility really encourage international collaboration. So these are a few pointers from CFI.
Thanks, Claire. Danica, how about your perspectives?
Sure. Thank you. So, from a research funder perspective, and again, I've worked at the 3 national funders over the course of my career. If I think about it, overall, there may be differences in how the research funding flows, but I think fundamentally, if you distill it down, the approaches can be quite similar across the different countries and across the different agencies, in so much as effective program design and peer review criteria are important in enabling the collaborative research. So we know that collaborative research can be encouraged at all levels of the research ecosystem, and I think Alexandra mentioned this, so at the researcher to researcher, that individual level or the departmental level or organization to organization partnerships or country to country agreements. And so these collaborations we also see them across disciplines and across sectors at all levels through those hierarchies as well. And we know that the collaborations are always bringing more diverse perspectives on a research topic, and that always leads to a better research outcome. Alexandra, you spoke of the grand challenges as well, and I think that's crucial to collaborate in order to address those. So I won't go into extensive examples here in the Canadian context, but I wanted to point out a few to sort of speak to each of those different types of collaborations. In terms of researcher to researcher, I would speak to the NSERC, that's the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, their recent launch of the Discovery Horizons program, which is still a pilot program. This is an interdisciplinary program that encouraged, through quite innovative program design, out-of-the-box thinking and new interdisciplinary teams to come together to tackle research that traditionally wouldn't have been supported through NSERC's main Discovery Grants program. And that's been very successful. So in that case, setting out different program design criteria and different peer review criteria allowed this kind of collaboration to take shape and form. And I think that's very exciting from a program design perspective. In terms of organization to organization, the one that came to my mind was the Canada First Research Excellence Fund, which is administered through the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, SSHRC, the Tri-Agency Institutional Program Secretariat there. And this is funding that flows to universities to support major transformational research in areas of strategic importance to Canada. So again, those kind of grand challenges, concepts. And there's an emphasis in the program criteria to leverage additional research capacity and resources and to promote knowledge mobilization and partnerships through Canadian institutions, the private sectors, international research institutions, and the public and not-for-profit organizations. So again, there it really promotes that institution to institution or organization to organization partnership in the program design and the peer review criteria. And then if I think of country to country, I know NSERC does have collaborations with the DFG in Germany, so I won't speak specifically to that, but the one that came to mind was the New Frontiers in Research Fund Horizon Europe call, which enabled Canadian researchers that were named on an eligible Horizons Europe application to apply for kind of Canadian funding to be able to participate in this international funding. So this was a really, again, program design and peer review, but intentionally set up to allow this country to country collaboration. And I will stop there and pass it back over to you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Danica.
So one of the things we hear over and over, at least we do in Canada, and I heard it in Germany as well when I was there, is the real challenge of infrastructure. So infrastructure, long, complex initiatives that take, 25-year horizons sometimes to actually get launched by the time you think of the policy idea, getting the funding and approvals and moving forward. So they're initiatives that you really want to do well. They're expensive and they're great opportunities and a huge investment. So to design them in a way that you're encouraging that sort of collaboration, like it could be an opportunity, the infrastructure itself is an opportunity, but the funding program or the approach of how we plan for infrastructure could be an opportunity to enhance cross-sectoral collaboration. So it's kind of a big question, and you could take it anywhere you would like. So I'm going to ask all of you to weigh in on this, because of course this is one that's really important to us, because that's the core of Laboratories Canada, what we're trying to untangle. And it's designing them in the right location with the right strategic opportunities, trying to guess what's going to be happening. So, thinking of all of the disruptions are just increasing at a much faster pace. So how, in your experience and your ideas, since you're all in this field, whether it's sharing resources, coming up with programs, how would you, or what would be your advice to when you're thinking about an infrastructure program that really incentivizes this and is planning in the right way to set it up for the future? what would be some of the things that you would advise us to think about, or if you could help us design this, what would be some of your thoughts there? So I'm going to open it up to everybody. I'm going to start with Alexandra, and then I'll turn to Danica, probably Peter and Claire. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you made already the point. Building up infrastructure is itself a challenge nowadays. If we look at large infrastructures, also outside research, but why shouldn't it be a large challenge within research? Why? Because the technology is moving so fast, but the planning time is so long. So maybe if I plan an infrastructure today or a new lab today, and it's going to be built up, I don't know, in 6-7 years, by then the technology is a completely different one. So you need other competences when you do that. And it's always good to ask other people and not be alone. So, and maybe other countries or other disciplines like physics or something where a lot more, how can I say, experienced in planning these things, or even ask from other sectors, you know, from the industry. Get people in this planning phase and organizing phase, and then I think it's key to make the infrastructure accessible, and this has a cultural dimension and also an atmospheric dimension, because if let's say you are the main PI for a certain infrastructure, it's maybe more difficult to share it, and you know, you want to take care of it. It's your baby. You don't want others to, I don't know, make a mistake on it and ruin it. So it's really also a cultural and atmospheric challenge to incentivize it to open. In Germany, and Peter, I think, can describe that better than I can do, but we have certain funding programs where the infrastructure is only funded if you share it, otherwise you don't get it, you know. So I think it's these two categories, from the funder side, but also from the management side of the universities and of the research centers, to make it a really very normal cultural thing to share the things, also because the dimension is too big of these infrastructures to be able to manage them by yourself. That's impossible. So that would be my starting point, and I'm really curious to hear how others contribute, add.
And I'll just jump right in. So you've raised some excellent points around the timing. I think that is one thing that I've seen in my years, is that the planning for big infrastructure and the time that it takes, everything changes in the meanwhile. And I would add as well, the kind of the political overlay too, that you know, within the realm of the federal public system, if there's political or government changes within that planning cycle as well, that can also throw off really big investments, or at least change the trajectory a little bit. I did want to focus on, you know, some key elements in program design, you know, taking into account all of the great points that you raised. And it's pretty basic stuff, but I think it's worth repeating, you know, in terms of setting up clear program objectives that underscore the importance of collaboration, just articulating that out of the front, that when you're setting up these as a funding agency, these programs, if this is the intent of that funding, then we need to make that clear to everybody involved. Likewise, for the evaluation criteria, we have programs that emphasize the degree to which the grant addresses partnerships or interdisciplinarity, and we ensure that the reviewers take that into account during the deliberation. So being, again, really clear with what the intent of the program is. In some cases, I've actually seen things like a pass-fail evaluation criteria put in place if you didn't convincingly bring in different disciplines, and if the evaluation required that. So I found that an interesting, it's not necessarily popular, but it is an interesting design element. Eligibility too, from a funding program perspective. So you want to make sure you're setting the program up so it facilitates and enables non-academic researchers or people from outside the academic sector to easily apply with the academic partner, which is sometimes easier said than done. And so, you know, I'll use the example, maybe not so much in the case of large scale research infrastructure, but, you know, in terms of knowledge users and community users, they may not know how to navigate, you know, a structured CV like what we have in Canada, and that may be prohibitive to bringing on additional partners in the collaborative space. Effective communications, I think everybody has touched on this. I know, Peter, you certainly said this in your introductory remarks, that, you know, ensuring that the research community and the reviewers and everyone involved appreciate and understand the goals of the program and how to assess the research collaboration and the contributions of the non-academic partner is key, and understanding each other's language in this. So if you're coming from one discipline and someone else is coming in from a different sector, that's a challenge in and of itself in terms of collaboration. So making sure you understand each other's language there. And the last piece that I would say is, and again, Alexandra touched on accessibility, making sure that there's really no barriers to the process from application through to decision making. So reviewing everything from start to finish, ensuring there's accessibility so that you can bring all the right people on board. I will pass it over. I don't know who's next.
Peter, I'll turn it to you, and then Claire will conclude.
Okay, fine, thank you. I hope I could be better understood if I move closer to the microphone, because there seems to be a problem with my 10-year-old computer. I think for the timing from the first idea to the infrastructure itself, you need to have quite some period for preparation. You need to find the right community, the right partners. You need to get strong funding commitments from all the funding partners. This is what we try to achieve in Germany on the state level, federal level. It's also what we try to achieve in Europe, although it's even a little more difficult than just on the national level. So that changes in politics and government do not affect you immediately. Now, what proved to be quite worthwhile is something we do on the European level. The European Commission funds research infrastructures in the preparatory phase. So practically from a first outlined idea up to the point where they are really starting to spend real money for the planning procedure. I think that's a key issue for establishing a successful structure. But once the structure is operating, of course, times have changed, persons have changed, so you need to keep the community involved until the facility goes into operation, and you need to try to react, of course, to all the changes. But that could be normally done if you involve also the scientists in the planning of the infrastructure. And one additional thing is, on the European level, we have it mandatory that there should be an open access for all European scientists. Mostly it's done worldwide. And there should be a policy to by the infrastructure to allow such access and to select mainly on scientific criteria. We are trying to do that in some infrastructures in Germany, although it's sometimes difficult to have access to one infrastructure in one of the states from researchers from a university in another state. But we try to overcome that, and this is quite some political effort. So what we need for an infrastructure is sustainable planning, sustainable funding commitments, and permanent exchange with the scientific community. Scientists should be involved in the planning. If we just leave it to the engineers or to the funders, it might end up in a mess.
I think my fellow panelists have raised the point many times about how important it is to get the program design right. If the criteria are well articulated, then we will get the desired outcome. So for us at CFI, traditionally, because we fund like heavy infrastructure, expensive infrastructure, is that we do not interact directly with the researchers. We interact with their institutions. And in the program design, there is a clear sustainability criterion, and that is the engagement of the institution to maintain and care for this infrastructure, to make sure it's accessible to a large number of people, etc. So this is by design. That's what we normally do. But now, recently, the bar has moved higher. So the Canadian government has declared a biomanufacturing strategy. This is to make our country more resilient for future health threats. And in this, they want not only CFI to work well, they want CFI to work in an integrated fashion with the 3 other granting agencies. So this level of integration, existed a little bit, but now it's like really desirable. And the way this new competition will proceed, it's going to have a step in which research hubs will be identified. So researchers across the country and their institutions have to be good team players and look and assemble teams. And a team will be called the hub. And it's going to be a group of actors from the whole ecosystem. So academic institutions, governmental labs, private sector, and reaching out also to international collaborators. This is very desirable to have a very extensive and a hub that covers all the ecosystem. And these hubs, when they will be selected, there will be 3 or 5 of them across Canada. Then they will be the ones applying for grants that will include infrastructure, but also research projects and talent development. So moving in a holistic fashion, not keeping infrastructure on the side. So this is the new direction we're going at the moment. And I must say it's not without difficulties, but I think the scope for achieving great things is there. Well, I'm an optimist. Yeah, here we go. I said it.
Well, thanks for that, Claire, and everybody on you've raised some really interesting perspectives, but I want to maybe also build upon an area, and I think we started our conversation with our German colleagues talking about some of the complexities of 16 states and permutations that we're trying to try to organize and coordinate. Canada and Germany, I would suggest, are similar in that we both have what I would call, for lack of a better term, jurisdictional barriers. We have federal systems, provincial, state systems, university systems, and other groups. And each of those areas, I think it was talked about earlier, and by many, about communications and having, Danica, you mentioned a common vision, a common approach about how and what we want to do in our investment. But how can we overcome some of these issues? And maybe Peter, I may ask you, and then maybe followed up by Claire and others, just to give maybe some examples. For example, in the European system, you have the European high performance computing network that was established. Peter, I know you mentioned this, in some of the other conversations that we had. And this is a joint, for people that don't know, this is a joint initiative between the European Union, European countries, and private partners, basically looking at developing a world-class supercomputing ecosystem in Europe. Surely to try to set something like that up across jurisdictions and across programs and sectors must have had some barriers and challenges. Can you maybe comment on what is it working well? Are there some things that could have been done differently? And Claire, maybe in a Canadian context, are there some situations in Canada that you can maybe provide as an example? And I'll ask the other panelists to chime in after both of you give your perspectives.
Well, actually, this PRAISE program on supercomputing is actually working well. We have this European landscape of 27 now different states with completely different cultures, completely different university systems, and completely different levels of technology sometimes, in some cases. And high performance computing is one of the things where you really need to have quite some resources, which the small countries in Europe also cannot afford on their own. So the concept of PRAISE is that we combined high performance computing centers or computing clusters in 5 countries. In Germany, it's a cluster called Gauss Alliance, after the mathematician Gauss, with the locations in Stuttgart, Munich, and Munich near Cologne. And there are Spanish, French, and I don't recall now what the other countries are, facilities. These facilities have a common access system. So if you have a project, you just have a one-spot access. They have a joint program for training in high-performance computing, and they're giving courses and providing traineeships. And they have joint initiatives for the further development, especially software development, the communication between the centers, etc. And the great thing about it is that not only researchers from those 5 countries could access the system, but researchers from all member states of PRAISE, which is all member states of the European Union, and I think also some of the associated countries. So it's quite an open system. The most important thing behind it is the financing for this overall system, for the upper layer, for the open access, is done by the European Union. So they've spent over the last few years 130 million euros into the system. But most of the operations and the investment in the computing centers is done by the member states hosting these centers. So it works out well. The main point is you need to have a common agreement on how the collaboration and the access is financed. And we have this with this system of the EU. We have more or less copied the system also on the national level for the tier 2 high-performance computing, so the lower level high-performance computing, where we got computing centers at 9 computing centers at German universities from different states to work together and to provide joint access, joint training, and joint software development, and so on, and open it nationwide. This was quite difficult because the states were very keen on keeping their investment for scientists of their countries, of their states. It could happen that a scientist from one state could not access the high-performance computer in the university 50 kilometers away in the other state. Also this system was mainly, the main incentive was that the federal government offered to pay 50% of the investment costs and operational costs of these centers if they join together and if they are open nationwide. Okay, that's a higher level of federal investment than the European Union investment is for the trace computing system. But what you need is to have some node, some central node, somebody pushing for the incentive to open such systems, and somebody ensuring the financing of this system. It's not necessarily the investment costs for the computers themselves, but the whole system, the interoperability and the access.
Right. So basically what you've got is again a model that is incentivizing and investing in the actual operationalization of the network and infrastructure that's there. Claire, from a Canadian point of view, what are your perspectives on sort of this kind of issue of jurisdictional barriers that you might be that have been encountered? How do you overcome them?
Well, my first reaction is compared to the European complexity, we're dealing with a piece of cake in Canada, right? No. Having said that, we have challenges. I would say, I know it sounds a little bland and very polite and very Canadian, like communications here is critical. Like at the CFI, if we rely on 40% matching funding from the province, you can imagine how important it is for us to foster close communication lines with the provinces. We need to talk to everybody in the ecosystem, and we've made practical efforts such as having a business person from MyTax in our offices. So MyTax is the organization that deals with internships with the private sector. We're talking, you know that we're talking to Labs Canada to see how we can move closer together, forward, and so forth. So that I would call communicate, to cultivate the will to collaborate. Now, once the will is there and kept there, then we have like the practical issues, and really the devil is in the details. So the first thing, and that has been quite like not as easy as you would think, is to delineate the fields of responsibility and the fields of influence. It's particularly challenging in Canada at the moment with the creation of the new Digital Research Alliance of Canada, since we're talking about computing here, and what the CFI would fund, what they would fund, and etc. And we're still in the process of defining, who does what and so forth, so that it's clear to our community. Things like signing MOUs between the different organizations early in the process, so that the flow of information goes, without obstacles, and then we don't have to pause every time we need to share something. These are like a bit like, they sound very operational and practical, but in practice, they make a lot of difference. And finally, since we are with our German guests today, I would like to talk about the Helmholtz Institute. So we have Helmholtz Institute in Canada, and they are, addressing global challenges like marine research, polar research, and so forth. And until recently that we did an internal little detective work at the CFI, we had no clue how much the CFI had invested in instruments that are hosted in these institutes. And it turns out to be a significant amount over the years. And all of this happened organically. So I think we need to pause and say, wow, this is fantastic. What was in place so that, organically it happens, and maybe, analyze what are contributing, parameters to this success. So I think this is what I have to contribute now. Yeah. I need to learn how to pronounce Helmholtz. Like I'm French speaking, right? So it's really a stretch for me. Yeah, quite good.
Quite close to the reality.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, all these words with H's and Z's. Yeah. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Natalka, maybe we'll move on to the next question. I'm also cognizant we've still got some things we'd like to cover with the panelists, and I'm also noting the time here.
Yeah, and there's also a question, so I want to make sure we have it's a good question that we have as well. So I think my next question is now trying to ground it in something that we're actually seeing. So in what we've just experienced. So we've talked about, you know, having infrastructure to position ourselves so that we can respond well. We've talked about how disruptive technologies are changing, jurisdictional challenges. So if we were now to ground this in a case that we all just lived through with the pandemic, where we saw that everyone had to come together and overcome a global challenge that requires the various perspectives in involving science throughout, everything from the research to being able to actually produce the vaccines quicker, test them quicker. So, I mean, it's really looking at it from that whole supply chain, and that crosses not just jurisdictional barriers or jurisdictional boundaries, but also now is having to involve industry and working with richer countries and poorer countries, and, you know, bringing it all together. So how it's a big question, but moving forward, how do we ensure that these resiliencies of our partnerships go forward? How do we stage it so that we're ready for next time? What role can we play? It's a very heavy question. So have fun with it. So I'm going to start with you, Danica.
Thank you. So I am not a supply chain expert, and so take these words for what that's worth. You know, I do think Canada has done a really great job with the biomanufacturing strategy. I know we've talked about that a little bit. It brings, you know, all the key players together across all the sectors nationally to the table. There's a clear strategy, objectives, performance indicators, decision-making process, and governance in place. You know, as with any partnership, identifying the gaps in the areas for growth nationally, working across all the partners from the start to the finish to ensure that there's that common vision. And I've talked about that already. All of that's embraced with this biomanufacturing strategy. We've said this, I think every person around this table has, or this virtual table has said this, continuous communications is key. I always go back to that old George Bernard Shaw quote, and I will probably misquote it, that says that the single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has taken place. This is something for me that's the crux of all good collaborations and partnerships, being clear on the goals and the expectations for partnerships. So that's what I will always go back to in terms of maintaining good partnerships and resilience. I'll pass it back over to you.
Is there anyone that particularly would like to answer this? I'm happy to open it up. Claire, go ahead.
Yes, so I would like to follow up what Danica has just said about the biomanufacturing strategy and the role of infrastructure. So as part of this strategy, there will be several competitions. And then we just completed the first one. And the first one was a competition to renovate biocontainment labs. So the idea here is that first we need, you know, good spaces, modern spaces, and then in which then, you know, the talent will be developed, like research projects will take place and so forth. So the thing about the strategy is that it follows a long timeline and several different steps. And I think it was a wise idea to invest in the space like really early on.
Peter or Alexandra?
Perhaps one thought. I think the thing about resiliency, what I was surprised of in the COVID crisis was how quickly our infrastructures could react. Actually, we were starting to funding a new lab in the city of Vienna, new institute for photonics and virology. And when I called them, have you started? No, we haven't started because we have changed. For a couple of months, we will build respiratory devices for hospitals. That was in the beginning of the crisis. The good thing was with this joint view on this crisis, not only the research infrastructures or individual researchers did react, but also the states, the funding side, did react very quickly. I couldn't imagine my colleagues to be being so quick before, and also the regulators, so the health authorities, etc. And what was surprising was that a lot of the contacts that our institutes had on the European level and internationally began to work. And at least from this European perspective, it was at least a common European effort to overcome this crisis and develop things. And I think there was also quite a lot of, well, let's say, transatlantic communication. Because they simply use their established ties of cooperation in all kinds of fields to focus on this new crisis. So I think communication, establishing channels of communication, allowing communication is a very key issue because we do not know what the next crisis will be.
Maybe I add, there is this saying, never waste a crisis. I think let's take the positive things, but I would always also say, never waste times of peace, because these collaborations and these contacts and this network were built up in times of peace. And I know rules are different in times of crisis, and at the moment we have multiple crises, at least here in Europe, with the war in front of our doors, the energy crisis, and still the pandemic is still going on. So use maybe both times, but I think really what made us strong in this pandemic was that in times of peace we build up these collaborations. Thank you.
Well, I think given the comments, I mean, this is a fascinating conversation, I think, that we're getting into now. I think one of the things that maybe a final set of questions maybe to contemplate or think about is we talk about communications, but we also have not talked about common language. And what I mean by this is the information that policymakers and what they're expecting and using to develop policies or whatever are not necessarily the same type of information that our scientific colleagues or others basically think that they need to communicate. There's often a gap between the communications of disciplines, of expectations. What do you mean by that? And often communications is not just the exchange of information, but one thing we didn't talk about is early on establishing trust in relationships. I mean, and communication changes. I know that in Canada, when we're also working very strongly to start working with more community-based work with our Indigenous knowledge holders and other groups. And the types of communication that we have in terms of science and how we inform policy and others, we're not necessarily on the same wavelength in terms of how we deal with that. Maybe just around the table, what do you think we need to do to improve sort of the aspects of communications? I mean, some people refer to the term knowledge translation or approaches of how we become more effective at it. It's not necessarily just getting into a meeting room and hoping that transdisciplinary approaches, they understand each other and they've got a common vision that they can come out of there. Often it takes some work. what do you think that kind of preparatory work would need to be, and how, based on your experiences, and how would we move that forward?
Shall I start, or
Anybody? Yeah, Alexander. I've left the floor open, so anybody's got some thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I can say here in Berlin at the Berlin University Lines, our vision is to overcome these boundaries and really integrate all the different members of society into research, and we call it the integrated research area. So what we are trying is, at the moment, we are piloting a number of projects to co-design new formats of, we call it exchange. It's not just communication, but it's really exchange. And it's been quite interesting. And it's, again, there is no one fits all. So you need another language, but because you also have different interests. If you talk to policymakers, politicians, or if you talk to young people, children, if you talk to civil organizations. So we're really doing a trial and error, I would say, approach by inviting them and co-creating with them what a good format would be, and not saying, okay, us researchers, we know what the format is. You just have to understand and listen. So I think we're just at the beginning of really opening up and also getting out the boundaries of our heads when we do that, and step into a new dimension.
That's super, Alexander. Danica, I was going to call upon you. The Museum of Nature, you must be facing this, in a major way.
Absolutely, and everywhere. I just wanted to build off of Alexandra's great point, and you mentioned it too, Fred, as well, the knowledge translation. And I really am a big proponent of integrated knowledge translation, where you have the knowledge users, the policymakers, the communities built into the design, and you do that co-development and that co-creation as you go along. And so it's this iterative back and forth understanding each other's worlds, and it's really about relationship building ultimately up front. So I think that's a critical piece to all of this. From a Canadian perspective too, we are at the Canadian Science Policy Conference, and so I did want to give a big shout out to all the tremendous work that they've done, because that has brought together policymakers and knowledge users with the science and the research expertise. And so I think that's been a great venue to kind of build that common language and share experiences and expertise across both sides. I also wanted to give a big shout out to the students across this country. There's a lot of great networks of students who are doing a lot of policy work to try to advance and advocate for different challenges and things across this country in the areas of science. And then I also wanted to say that, we have in our federal government, we have the creation of a new science committee that's chaired by Dr. Kirsty Duncan. And that's opened up the dialogue as well between scientists and parliamentarians on topics of crucial importance to science and research. So both providing the venues for these conversations where you can mix the politicians and the policymakers and the scientists together, and being able to do that kind of co-creation, I think is really important.
Thank you so much. Any other thoughts, Peter, Claire, on this
yes,
topic?
What Alexandra said is what we are trying to achieve in Germany generally. We are also trying to establish funding schemes and support also for universities to go into this point of citizen science communication. Now, one thing that concerned me during the COVID crisis was that on the one hand, we started off with a chancellor, and she was a scientist, so it was easy for the science to communicate the risks and the scientific background into politics. On the other hand, the more it affected society, the more there were these concerns, let's go back from the scientific advice, we cannot take the scientific advice for granted, etc. So somehow the perception of science had changed during the crisis from a peak of belief in science down to a, well, let the scientists talk, we do what is good for us, whatever we think. And this is one thing where we have to struggle with and where we have to go against. And okay, actually, I don't know any perfect solution in Germany, but just to go on as we did with trying to improve science communication.
Great, super.
Sorry, couldn't find the unmute button. So I think we're coming up to time, but I did want to read out a question because we did get a question. So if I'll just read it out, and if anybody wants to throw some thoughts together, that would be most welcome. So I'm reading the question now. Sharing infrastructure and expertise well takes a lot of work. Individual researchers don't typically have the time or expertise to do this. Can the panel comment on sustainable funding opportunities for networks and people to facilitate this? The EU-funded Euro Bioimaging is a fantastic example of this. They are sharing equipment across 14 countries and has more than a dozen full-time dedicated people make it all work. Anyone have any comments?
Yeah, that's a tendency we observe, especially on the European level, that there are a lot of new distributed virtual infrastructures like Euro Bioimaging. They are, as I mentioned, composed by this geometry variable, so we have only 14 of all the EU member countries in this scheme. And it's more or less a system of bringing data and databases together, or we have others in the environmental sector where it's more or less about bring the results of sensors in the environment together into a database and make it accessible to everybody. It's funded by institutions from the member states, and the EU is also there funding the incentive. The EU is funding the European Science Cloud, which eventually should be a cooperation to host this data and to develop also common data standards so that they will be exchangeable not only between countries but also cross-disciplinary. So yes, that's an approach, and it was a development, I think, if I recall, the past 6-7 years, out of the development of physical infrastructures. When we brought them together, and we have seen that there was a need by the science to share data, and those proposals came up from science. And they were not invented by the European Union. They came up from science because there was this strong research in several projects, and they saw we need to have some way to exchange data and to have common access to each other's data, and I think it's worthwhile doing this, and we have a number of these, not just Euro Bioimaging.
Right, we're not seeing anyone else have their hand up. We're good.
Natalka, if I could comment, I think with this question, I think Peter's example, this is again an example of where there's dedicated resources that are identified and put to the need. Again, once you have the equipment and once you have these networks, often it's the sustainability of that, and it can often, these things can't be run on the side of people's desks. You need to have, resilience in the system, and we've talked about that, but also long-term investment. And I think this is still an area that's under development with many of our programs, where I've seen, and I'll give an example very quickly, in the Arctic, when we had major international polar year type of investments and other things, and then all of a sudden it's gone. and the some of the infrastructure investment and capacity that was built, the momentum is no longer there. And so I think with many of these networks, we need to really think about how we build resiliency and support to make these things sustainable.
A lot of very, very good points raised today. So just invite people from the audience, if you have want to continue some of these conversations, please do get in touch with us. I guess things that sort of struck out for me was the importance of good design planning. So that came through, and from many of you, and it needs to be thought through various sectors. The criteria have to be really clear and transparent. They also have to be nimble. And so I liked Alexandra's approach of in times of peace, you need to make sure that you use that time and effectively, so that when there's a crisis, then we have the networks and have a lot of that built out already. A lot of good examples about if there really is a crisis. It's amazing how everybody's able to pull together very well and build infrastructure that normally would take years and years otherwise, but suddenly can be produced because of the networks and a lot of the work that's already done. So science policy also plays a really important role here. So with that, I just want to thank everyone very much for a fantastic conversation today. Both our colleagues here in Canada and also our German guests. So many thanks to all of you and for joining us today. And thank you very much for the audience for joining us as well. Thanks. That's it for me. Thank you, Fred.
Likewise, thank you, panelists, for joining us today. A very interesting session. And all of the people that have dialed into this session, we hope that the dialogue that we've had and the conversation has had you think about a little bit more of some of the challenges that we've identified today. So again, thank you very much to everybody.